Giza, today a peripheral borough of Cairo, 12 kilometers southwest of the city center, stands on the left bank of the River Nile, on the border with the Western Desert. In the past, it was one of the Memphis necropolises. This is where the pyramids were built for the burial of 4th dynasty pharaohs, Cheops, Khephren, and Menkaure. The pyramids have a square base. They are extraordinarily large and were covered in such a way that their surface was perfectly flat. The Cheops Pyramid, also known as the Great Pyramid, is the northernmost of the 3 built in Giza, as well as being the tallest and most impressive of the ones built in ancient Egypt. Its total surface area covers more than 4 hectares. The ancient entrance is on the northern side, at a height of about 15 meters. But the modern visitor enters through a passage opened by the Caliph Mamun in the 9th century AD, slightly lower than the original entrance. A narrow corridor leads, first descending, then rising to the Great Gallery, and then to the king's chamber, covered with granite slabs. The sarcophagus where the mummy of Cheops was laid is also made of granite. One should not be surprised by the extraordinary size of the tomb. The king was considered a god for all intents and purposes. The pyramids were the apparent display of the quality difference between normal human beings and the pharaoh, a god on earth, custodian of the country's unity, order, and prosperity. The Khephren Pyramid is lower than the nearby one of Cheops. However, it looks taller because it was built on a slightly raised location. On top of the monument, there is still most of the original smooth external covering made of Tura limestone. Apart from these tombs, among the most significant monuments, mention should also be made of the gigantic statue of the Sphinx. It has the body of a crouched lion and a human-shaped head, resembling the traits of Pharaoh Khephren. When General Bonaparte arrived in Egypt, only the head and parts of the shoulders emerged from the sand. Giza is mentioned by the Greek historian Herodotus, who visited Egypt around 450 BC in the 2nd book of his Historiae. He writes that the Pyramid of Cheops was built using, among other things, machines made of short wooden sticks, probably a sort of rocker arms, which were used to transfer the block from one level to another. Ancient testimonies, on the other hand, only show the technique based on the construction of ramps. These are inclined planes made of raw bricks and rubble, along which the blocks, loaded onto sledges, were carried. Herodotus himself also writes that the construction of the Cheops Pyramid in Giza involved 100,000 men working in turn, each of them for 3 months, and that on top of the pyramids, it is possible to read in Egyptian letters how much was spent for the workers in radishes, onions, and garlic. The pyramids were not built by men kept in slavery, but rather by farmers hired by the pharaoh during the months when they could not work because of the Nile floods, and supported using state money. Epet Isut, the most selected of places, as Karnak was called in ancient times, was the sacred section of Thebes, capital of Egypt during the New Kingdom and holy city of Ammon. It is the largest archaeological complex in Egypt, mostly surrounded by the walls of Ammon. A short distance away, there are 3 other rows of walls. The southern one dedicated to the bride of the god Mut, the eastern one to Khonsu, the couple's son, and the northern one to Montu, the original deity of the whole Thebes area. The large Ammon walls are shaped like a 4-sided trapezium. They are made of raw bricks about 8 meters thick and include 8 stone doors. To the northwest, the monumental entrance of the first pylon, where the procession boats arrived, is preceded by an avenue flanked by Sphinx statues. In front of the first pylon there is a basin, fed by a canal with water from the Nile. From a pier, it was possible to see the boats being steered during solemn celebrations. An avenue with ram-shaped sphinxes, protecting an image of Pinugem I, connected the pier to the temple. There was another monumental entrance to the south at the level of the 10th pylon of the temple, oriented towards the walls of Mut. The row of walls also included other monuments, such as the temples dedicated to Opet, other small temples and chapels, and a large sacred lake. The first pylon of the Temple of Ammon was the main entrance. The central door of the pylon led to the courtyard. The large courtyard opening behind the first pylon of the Temple of Karnak was built by the Bubasti kings of the 22nd dynasty from Libya. To the left and right of the visitors, arcades were built. The southern one to the right included a temple of Ramses III. To the left of the temple there is a large door, the only decorated one on the south side of the courtyard with reliefs and inscriptions of the 22nd dynasty. This is why it was known as Bubastiti Arcade. In the center, the remains of a kiosk built by Taharqa. The second pylon is preceded by a sort of vestibule, at the entrance of which the 2 colossal Ramesses II statues were placed. After the entrance pylon, the courtyard delimited by large arcades, and the second pylon with chapels and sacred boat warehouses, you enter the extraordinary hypostyle room of the temple. It is 103 meters wide and 52 meters deep. It is an impressive view with its 134 enormous papyrus-shaped sandstone columns divided into 16 rows. The 12 columns in the central nave, more than 23 meters tall, have open chalice capitals. The other 122 columns with a closed chalice capital are about 10 meters smaller. This difference in height made it possible to open between the architrave and the ceiling stone grid windows, one of which is still almost intact. The Temple of Ammon at Karnak was the most important religious institution in Egypt, both from an ideological and economic point of view. Its foundation dates back at least to the 12th century, and the pharaohs in charge competed in building increasingly majestic monuments there. A long alley flanked by sphinxes connected the complex to Luxor, the other major cultural center in Egypt. In the southern area, on the banks of the Nile, stands the Temple of Ammon, also including the small Abu el-Hagag Mosque, built in the 13th century AD. The Temple of Luxor was dependent on that of Karnak, to which it was connected by a processional route. It was called Lipet Imen Rezit, the southern harem of Ammon, and during the great feast of Opet, the statue of the god was carried there from Karnak by a solemn procession. The modern-day remains of the ancient building are the work of two great pharaohs of the New Kingdom, Amenophis III and Ramesse II. The Temple of Ammon in Luxor, designed at the time of Amenophis III, featured a traditional plan. It was preceded by a pylon through which visitors entered a large courtyard with a double arcade on three sides, then the hypostyle room. The arcades and hypostyle room are supported by papyrus-shaped fasciculated columns. Ramesses II, the 19th dynasty, added a courtyard in front of the building with a double arcade on its four sides. Colossal granite statues representing the pharaoh were placed in the spaces between the columns of the first row on the south side. In front of the pylon of the temple in Luxor, on the sides of the entrance gate, there are 6 colossal Ramesses II statues, 2 of them seated and 4 standing. The 2 statues immediately to the left and right of the gate are made of grey granite. They show the pharaoh seated and are more than 15 meters tall. Memphis, royal residence and capital of Egypt during the Old Kingdom, was supposedly founded by Menes, the first pharaoh in Egyptian history. In an area reclaimed from the marshes on the border between Upper and Lower Egypt, on the plain on the eastern banks of the Nile in front of Saqqara, its great necropolis. The name Saqqara derives from the local tribe of Beni Sokhar, who settled in the area during the Middle Ages. The most significant monument in the necropolis is undoubtedly the step pyramid of Djoser, a pharaoh of the 3rd dynasty. His architect, Imhotep, initially designed a great mastaba, placed at the center of a large row of walls, with projecting sections and recesses, covering a total surface of about 15 hectares. The project was greatly modified, with the mastaba changed to a pyramid with 6 steps, about 60 meters tall. On the northern side of the pyramid, there is the entrance to the underground rooms. Through a series of corridors with several rooms on the side, you reach the burial chamber of the pharaoh, 28 meters under the base. This is where some parts of the Djoser mummy were found. To the south, a narrow passage leads to a long courtyard flanked by chapels with a horizontal or arched covering. They reproduced the kiosks made of reeds, then of wood, of the pre-dynasty age and of the first dynasties. The doors are shown open or closed, with the hinges and chains also cast in stone, but they do not lead to any room because the small buildings are full-bodied. The Jubilee complex of the Djoser pyramid in fact reproduced the architectural structure made of perishable materials used for the sovereignty regeneration celebration. The latter was a purely magic symbolic occasion, which is why these were fake buildings which could be used only by the soul of the dead pharaoh. Dendera, which in the age of pharaohs was called Unetantere, was the capital of Upper Egypt. Its remains are on the western bank of the Nile, at the level of the town of Cana, where the river makes a sharp bend. Here, a row of raw bricks encloses a large sacred area, in the center of which stands the temple of the goddess Hathor, made of sandstone and oriented towards the Nile. The pilgrims reached the river from the wharf and arrived at the sacred enclosure from an arcaded avenue after the purification rites at the fountains next to the entrance. The river in this point flows from east to west. This means that the main entrance is to the north and has a monumental door dating back to the age of the emperors Domitian and Trajan. The courtyard in front of the temple with the columns and pylons of the northern door was never completed. The temple was erected in the 1st century BC under the last of the Ptolemies during the reign of Augustus on the site of another building, probably dating back to the ancient kingdom then expanded in later years. The Temple of Hathor consists of a first large hypostyle room, followed by a second space which was used as a vestibule. The large hypostyle room in the Temple of Hathor at Dendera is supported by 24 Hathoric columns. The front row forms the facade. It is surmounted by a molding in the center of which the winged disk of the sun can be seen. The internal and external spaces between the columns are decorated with offering scenes surrounded by inscriptions. The interior of the room is particularly fascinating. In the semi-darkness, the face of Hathor from above the columns attracts the visitor's gaze from any position. Offering scenes framed by texts completely cover the walls and column shafts. The column's capital shows the face of Hathor on the 4 opposing sides, surmounted by a rectangular representation of the sistrum. Inside the row of walls perpendicular to the large temple stand the Roman Mamesis, built in the age of Augustus, and the Mamesis of Nectanebus I, a pharaoh of the 30th dynasty. On the western side you have the sacred lake and the sanatorium for all those who slept in the temple area and then asked the priests to interpret their dreams. The island of Philae, from the ancient Egyptian Pilak, literally the Isle of the Temple of Ra, is in the vicinity of the first Nile Dam, about 5 kilometers south of Aswan. This important pilgrimage site was the home of Isis and Horus as a child. The sacred place where Osiris was buried, also known as He Who Rests in Philae, was called the Holy Island. It could be visited only with the permission of the highest-ranking priests, and it was a stronghold and one of the last outposts along the border with Nubia. The most ancient monuments date back to the 25th and 30th dynasty. Psammetichus II, sovereign of the 26th dynasty, built a small kiosk which was intended as a stopping point for priests' processions to the tomb of god Osiris on the nearby Isle of Biga, which overlooks the kiosk. Most of the monuments date back to the Ptolemaic Roman age. The large temple of Isis, completed by Ptolemy III Euergetes, can be reached from the kiosk of Nectanebus, which leads to a wide space enclosed by 2 arcades of the Roman age, and to the north by the first pylon. From here you reach a courtyard enclosed by the Mamisis and by columns, and at the back by the second pylon. You then enter the hypostyle room of the Temple of Isis, which features 10 columns and floral capitals, one different from the other. From the hypostyle room, you reach the innermost rooms part of the temple, culminating with the sanctuary. On the eastern bank, the Roman Imperial Age Trajan's kiosk is the monumental transformation of the oriental access to the island, a stopping place and pier for some procession rites in honor of goddess Isis. When the procession landed, this is where the sacred boat on which the effigy of the goddess was moored. The cult of Isis ended abruptly towards the end of the 6th century, when a Christian king from Ethiopia invaded Lower Nubia. when the Aswan Dam was built, the monuments on the island were flooded. An international mission, thanks to the funds provided by UNESCO, made it possible to move the monuments to the nearby island of Aguilkia. The project took 10 years to complete. Every monument was dismantled, then assembled again piece by piece. In 1986, the new temple seat was inaugurated. Not far from the western bank of the Nile in the western part of Thebes, it is still possible to visit the monumental ruins of the burial temples of Pharaoh Mentuhotep and Queen Hatshepsut from the 11th and 12th dynasty respectively. The scene is extremely fascinating, with a rocky cliff overlooking the temples, forming a sort of giant natural amphitheater. The modern name, literally Northern Convent, derives from the presence there during the Christian age of a religious community. Later on, Thutmose III built a temple dedicated to the god Ammon in the middle of the two burial complexes, whose plan was very similar to that of the Hatshepsut monument. In the Mentuhotep burial complex, a valley temple and a long monumental alley led to the large clearing in front of the funereal temple, with tamarisk and sycamore plants. In front of it, there were two arcades with columns and a monumental ramp leading to the terrace, where a large hypostyle room, almost completely destroyed today, supported a basement and a structure which for a long time was thought to be a pyramid. The last part of the complex consists of a courtyard, a hypostyle room, and a chapel with a fake tomb. A long underground tunnel led to the actual tomb, which was in the west, far away from the burial complex. About 500 years later, Queen Hatshepsut ordered the construction of her own burial temple on the side of the Mentuhotep complex, using its structure as a model. The Hatshepsut burial temple, with its terraced structure, is certainly one of the most spectacular monuments on the western bank of Thebes. Thanks to its ingenious architecture, it merges well with the surrounding landscape, creating an extension to it. A temple downstream and a long monumental road ended in a large fenced courtyard, at the end of which two ramps led to the large terraces with arcades with columns and pillars, which included chapels dedicated to several deities and a series of reliefs. Among them, the description of the obelisks being transported from Aswan and their erection in the temple of Ammon. The birth and infancy of the Queen and the famous chronicle of the expedition to the mysterious land of Punt. On the northern side, there are a sanctuary dedicated to Ra and an open courtyard dedicated to Thutmose I, father of the Queen, and to his wives. On the western bank of the Nile, in front of the temples of Karnak and Luxor, there is West Thebes, an area 7.5 kilometers long, where some of the pharaohs had their burial temples built. In the deserted valleys behind them stood the village of Deir el-Medina. Its inhabitants, known as servants in the place of truth, were the workers and artisans in charge of building the royal tombs. The village had two access points, the main entrance to the north and the other to the south. A central road divided the village in two from north to south, while secondary roads connected the eastern and the western sections. Along the main road there were rows of houses. The plan of the house generally consisted of 4 rooms accessible from the road, walking down 1 or 2 steps and constructed along a single axis. First room included a sort of rectangular-shaped altar with steps, whose purpose is still unknown. In the center of the second room, the main room, stood a wooden column with a stone base. There were also niches for statues of deities. Outside the room there was a corridor leading to 1 or 2 rooms, which could be used as bedrooms or for storage, and to a staircase leading to the terrace. The last room in the house was the kitchen. It was an open workspace with all the necessary cooking equipment, a bread oven, a fireplace, jars, grindstone, and mortar. To the west of the village, under the Thebes Mountains, are Rupestrian and semi-Rupestrian tombs of the Ramessid period, with their pyramid superstructure remaining. The Sennajem tomb consisted of a room with a vaulted ceiling. The brightly colored paintings which decorate the rooms are images taken from the Book of the Dead, scenes where the deceased is shown with his family, and ritual scenes such as the embalming or the opening of the mouth. To the north, almost perfectly preserved, stood the temple consecrated to Hathor and Maat, and to two deified architects. The first is Imhotep, the top-ranking official who lived during the time of Pharaoh Djoser. The second, known as leader of all the king's works, served under Pharaoh Amenophis III. The name of Pharos, the small island in front of Alexandria, already appears in the fourth book of the Odyssey, in a dialogue between Telemachus, son of Ulysses, and Menelaus, king of Sparta. Menelaus, recounting his adventures after the fall of Troy, says that amid the very rough sea there is an island in front of Egypt, and a safe haven where fresh water can be found. The Pharos, erected in the time of Ptolemy II Philadelphos by Sostratus of Cnidus, was considered one of the seven wonders of the ancient world. The geographer and historian Strabo, during his trip to Egypt, explained in his work called Geography the reason behind the construction of the lighthouse. Since there was no shelter along the coast, which is shallow on every side and surrounded by rocks and shoals, it was necessary for all those who came from the open sea to have a tall and bright signal to facilitate their navigation towards the entrance of the port. The lighthouse stood where the fort of the Sultan Quiet Bay is today, on the eastern side of the Isle of Faroe. With a three-story structure, the first one quadrangular, the second octagonal, the third cylindrical, reaching an overall height of about 120 meters. Inside it, on the highest part, surmounted by a statue of Zeus, burnt a perennial fire, whose light was concentrated and projected by a set of mirrors, so that it could be seen from a great distance. Posidippus of Pella, in his epigram composed shortly after the Pharos was built, describes it as a tower rising towards the sky and visible from an endless distance. The mortuary temple of Ramesses III, the last of the great Thebes monuments, is mentioned in the inscriptions as dwelling of the million years of King Ramesses, joined for eternity to Amun-Ra, and is dedicated to the deified sovereign. The temple is in Medinet Habu, to the west of Thebes, and it is surrounded by strong walls. The pharaoh lived around 1100 BC. For its construction, he was inspired by Ramesseum, the temple of his predecessor, Ramesses II, who lived in the previous century. The outside walls are decorated with reliefs, showing the sovereign's military victories. The inside walls show family life scenes. The first temple pylon shows a traditional scene where the sovereign kills his enemies in the presence of Ammon and the effigy of Ra-Harakti. From here you reach the second temple courtyard, on the right walls of which there are pillars with colossal Osiris statues of the pharaoh, while in front of it stands the second pillar. The reliefs on the walls celebrate the sovereign's victories against Libya and the Sea Peoples, who had once again invaded Egypt, and which Ramesses III forced out of the country. From the first courtyard, a ramp with steps through another pylon leads to the second courtyard or celebration courtyard, with a rich, multicolored decoration which is still partly preserved. The decoration shows the tributes paid to the various deities and the religious processions on the occasion of the Feast of the Valley, whose points of arrival were the temples of Medinet Habu. The second courtyard is surrounded on the sides by arcades with closed chalice columns, while on the back of the second pylon there is a row of Osiris pillars. On the opposite side, a raised arcade on a row of Osiris pillars and one of columns leads to the hypostyle room, characterized in turn by massive close columns, of which only the lower sections are preserved.